At 0430 on November 7th, 2025, two Venezuelan diesel-electric submarines crept through Caribbean waters toward what their sonar officers believed was a lone American amphibious ship. The S-21 Bolivar and S-23 Sucre had been tracking the target for 18 hours using coastal radar data that showed a single massive contact lingering near Venezuela's exclusive economic zone. Their mission was simple: fire a warning torpedo, make a statement, then disappear beneath the thermal layer before anyone could respond. What the Venezuelan Navy did not know was that their 40-year-old radar system had merged 6 separate ships into one blurry return. They were not approaching an amphibious vessel conducting routine patrols. They were closing in on the USS Gerald R. Ford, a 100,000-ton nuclear-powered aircraft carrier worth $13 billion, escorted by 4 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and 1 Ticonderoga-class cruiser. The entire strike group carried more firepower than the Venezuelan Navy's surface fleet combined, and the Venezuelans were about to announce their presence with a torpedo. The question was not whether America would detect the threat. The question was whether cooler heads would prevail in the 3 seconds between detection and retaliation, because when you fire a weapon at a United States carrier, even by accident, you are gambling with national survival. So if you want to see how this near miss unfolded and why split-second decisions at sea can prevent wars that neither side wants, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next critical incident that almost changed everything. 0345, Venezuelan Operations Center, Caracas. Inside a dimmed command room beneath the Ministry of Defense, analysts stared at radar screens that had not been upgraded since 1987. The equipment hummed and clicked. Green phosphor displays flickered with each antenna rotation. A large contact blinked near the maritime boundary 70 nautical miles north of La Guaira. The signature was huge, bigger than a frigate, steadier than a cargo ship, and it had been sitting there for nearly 2 days. Senior Lieutenant Carlos Medina leaned over the display and traced the contact with his finger. The return measured roughly 300 meters in length. That size matched an American Wasp-class amphibious assault ship. Intelligence reports from the previous month had noted increased United States naval activity in the region, and Washington had been vocal about Venezuela's ties to external powers. To Medina, the presence of this lone vessel felt deliberate, a show of force, a test of Venezuelan resolve. He forwarded the data to Fleet Command with a recommendation: deploy submarines to investigate and deliver a measured response if necessary. The order came back within an hour. Dispatch the S-21 Bolivar and S-23 Sucre, approach to within engagement range, authorize a single warning torpedo on a shallow setting. Do not escalate beyond that point. What no one in Caracas understood was that their radar was lying to them. The coastal arrays lacked modern signal processing. Atmospheric ducting in the humid Caribbean air had bent and scattered the radar returns from multiple American ships. The system's filters could not separate the overlapping echoes. 6 vessels moving in tight formation appeared as a single massive blob. The technicians saw what their equipment could show them, and their equipment was blind to the truth. The Venezuelan submarines departed La Guaira Naval Base at 0500 on November 6th. Each crew had been briefed on the mission: locate the lone American ship, deliver a firm message without starting a war. The S-21 and S-23 were Russian-built Kilo-class diesel-electric boats, quiet when running on batteries, capable of shallow water operations, armed with Type 53 torpedoes, and a crew trained for coastal defense. Their combined cost was roughly $300 million, a fraction of what the Americans were sailing above them. 0415, Caribbean Sea, 70 nautical miles north of Venezuela. The Gerald R. Ford cut through calm waters at 18 knots. Around it, 4 destroyers maintained a defensive screen at intervals of 8 to 12 nautical miles. The cruiser USS Vela Gulf held position to the northeast, its SPY-1 radar sweeping the sky for aircraft and missiles. Beneath the waves, towed sonar arrays trailed behind the destroyers, listening for submarines. The entire formation moved with the confidence of a force that owned the ocean. On the bridge of the Ford, officers monitored routine traffic. A cargo ship passed to the east, Fishing boats clustered near the Venezuelan coast. The morning watch was quiet, no alerts, no threats, just another day of freedom of navigation operations in international waters. Below the surface, the two Venezuelan submarines closed the distance. They advanced at 4 knots to minimize noise. Their passive sonar painted a picture of heavy surface activity, propeller sounds, hull vibrations, the distinct low-frequency rumble of large diesel generators. The sonar operators noted the intensity and reported multiple contacts, but their orders were based on the radar data from Caracas, and that data said one ship at 0428, the S-21 Bolivar, reached its planned firing position. The crew had rehearsed this scenario dozens of times. A warning shot fired at shallow depth with a preset detonation timer. The torpedo would run for 90 seconds, then self-destruct harmlessly. The explosion would send a clear message: "We see you, we can reach you, stay away from our waters." Lieutenant Commander Alejandro Ruiz stood in the cramped control room and reviewed the firing solution one final time. Target bearing 015 degrees, range 4,000 meters, depth setting 6 meters, detonation timer 90 seconds. He looked at his weapons officer and gave the order: "Tube 1, fire." The Type 53 torpedo ejected from the submarine with a sharp hydraulic burst. The weapon's motor ignited, propellers bit into the water, and a bright acoustic signature exploded outward like a flare in the darkness. Every sonar operator on every American ship heard it instantly. 0429 USS Vela Gulf Combat Information Center. Petty Officer 2nd Class David Torres sat at his sonar station with headphones pressed against his ears. The background noise of the ocean was steady: biological activity, distant shipping. Then a sharp burst cut through the soundscape, high-pitched, mechanical, accelerating. Torres yanked off his headphones and turned to the watch officer. "Torpedo in the water, bearing 205, high-speed screws, active." The Combat Information Center erupted. The officer of the deck grabbed the radio. "All stations, this is Vela Gulf. Torpedo launch detected. Stand by for defensive measures." On the forward, alarm shrieked across the ship. The carrier began a turn to port, increasing speed to 22 knots. The destroyers adjusted their positions, moving between the carrier and the direction of the launch. Decoys splashed into the water, creating false acoustic targets. The MH-60 Romeo helicopter on the flight deck spooled up its engines, ready to deploy sonobuoys and hunting torpedoes. The American formation had drilled for this moment 1,000 times. Every crew member knew their role, every system activated in sequence. Within 45 seconds, the strike group had shifted from routine patrol to combat readiness. The Venezuelan torpedo continued its run. 6 meters below the surface, 90 seconds on the clock. Its guidance system tracked a rough bearing toward the noise above, but the weapon was never meant to hit anything. It was a message written in explosives and seawater. At 0430, the torpedo's timer reached 0. The internal charge detonated. A pressure wave surged outward. The explosion registered on every American sonar screen as a sharp concussive blast. To the operators, it looked identical to a hostile torpedo that had failed to find its target and detonated at the end of its run. The combat team on the Vela Gulf analyzed the sequence. 2 submerged contacts detected. Torpedo launch confirmed. High-speed run followed by detonation. The pattern matched a failed attack. Captain Jennifer Hayes stood at the center of the Combat Information Center and stared at the tactical display. 2 submarines, 1 torpedo, 1 explosion, and a carrier sitting exposed in the middle of the formation. She had 3 seconds to decide: fire back or wait for confirmation. The sonar screen showed no additional torpedoes inbound, no continuing threat, just silence after the blast. Hayes weighed the evidence. A real attack would have launched multiple weapons. A coordinated strike would have timed the torpedoes for simultaneous impact. This felt wrong, aggressive but incomplete. She gave the order: hold fire, maintain defensive posture, continue tracking. The decision saved both navies from a shooting war that neither government wanted. 0435 S-21 Bolivar depth 120 meters. Inside the Venezuelan submarine, the crew heard the explosion echo through the hull. Lieutenant Commander Ruiz nodded. The message had been delivered. Now it was time to leave before the Americans triangulated their position. He ordered a descent to 150 meters and a turn to the southwest at minimum speed. Then the sonar operator called out, "Multiple contacts above us, high-speed maneuvers, active sonar pinging. Sir, there are at least 5 large ships up there." Ruiz froze. 5 ships. The radar had shown 1. He pulled up the intelligence brief and read it again. Single American amphibious vessel, routine patrol, no escorts, but the sounds filtering through the water told a very different story. Turbine whine from gas turbine destroyers, the deep throb of a massive nuclear reactor, the coordinated movements of a formation designed to protect something valuable. They had not approached a lone amphibious ship. They had approached a carrier strike group. Ruiz felt his stomach tighten. A carrier group carried enough firepower to flatten every military installation in Venezuela within an hour. And he had just fired a torpedo at the center of that formation. Even a warning shot, even a harmless detonation, it did not matter. He had announced his presence to the most dangerous collection of warships on the planet. He turned to his crew. "All stop. Silent running. Descend to 200 meters. Do not make a sound." The S-21 Bolivar and S-23 Sucre sank into the thermal layer and disappeared from American sensors. Their retreat was slow, careful, and absolutely terrified. 0515 USS Gerald R. Ford Flag Bridge. Rear Admiral Patricia Crane reviewed the acoustic data with her staff. The timeline was clear. 2 submarines had approached the strike group. One had fired a torpedo set for shallow depth and short duration. The weapon had self-destructed after 90 seconds. No additional launches followed. The contacts had withdrawn. Crane leaned back in her chair. A warning shot fired by a Navy that thought it was dealing with a single ship. She almost laughed. The Venezuelans had walked into a carrier group by accident and tried to intimidate it with a single torpedo. It was like throwing a rock at a tank and then realizing the tank had friends. The question now was what to do about it. Escalation would achieve nothing. The Venezuelan government would deny the incident. Washington would protest. Caracas would call it a navigational error, and in 6 months they would be back in the same waters doing the same patrols. Crane authorized a message to Fleet Command. Contact with Venezuelan submarines. Warning torpedo fired and self-destructed. No damage, no casualties. Strike group remains on station. Recommend continued monitoring without escalation. She closed the report and looked out at the calm sea somewhere beneath those waves. 2 submarine crews were probably having the worst morning of their lives. 0600 Venezuelan Operations Center, Caracas. Senior Lieutenant Medina stood in front of his commanding officer and explained what had gone wrong. The radar system had merged multiple contacts into one. The submarines had approached a carrier strike group instead of a lone ship. The warning torpedo had detonated near the most valuable naval asset the United States possessed, and somehow the Americans had not retaliated. The commanding officer stared at him in silence. Then he asked the only question that mattered: "Did we start a war?" Medina shook his head. "No, sir. They held fire. The room exhaled. An investigation would follow. Reports would be written. Equipment would be upgraded. But the immediate crisis had passed. The Venezuelan Navy had gambled with a warning shot and survived only because the Americans chose restraint over revenge. By noon, the Gerald R. Ford and its escorts resumed their patrol route. The 2 Venezuelan submarines returned to La Guaira and filed incident reports that would remain classified for decades. Neither side publicized the encounter. Neither side wanted to explain how close they had come to a shooting war over a radar malfunction and a miscalculation. The numbers told the story better than any official statement. Venezuela had deployed $300 million worth of submarines armed with torpedoes that cost $70,000 each. The United States had sailed a strike group worth more than $30 billion, protected by sensors that could hear a shrimp click from 20 miles away. The Venezuelans fired 1 warning shot. The Americans held fire for 3 seconds and avoided a conflict that would have ended in minutes. That 3-second pause was the only reason the incident remained a near miss instead of a naval disaster. It demonstrated something fundamental about modern warfare. Technology can fail, intelligence can mislead, radar can lie, but the judgment of trained officers in the moment of crisis can prevent mistakes from becoming catastrophes. For analysts watching the Caribbean, the incident raised uncomfortable questions. If a 40-year-old radar system could confuse a carrier group for a single ship, what other blind spots existed in regional defense networks? If two submarines could approach within torpedo range before being detected, how many other nations were quietly testing American responses? And if the next warning shot came from a Navy with less restraint or better weapons, would 3 seconds still be enough time to avoid disaster? The sea returned to calm, the radar screens returned to routine, but the memory of that morning lingered in every operations center that reviewed the classified recordings, because in the end, it was not superior firepower or advanced technology that prevented escalation. It was the decision of one American captain to wait 3 seconds before pulling the trigger, and that fragile thread of human judgment is all that stands between miscalculation and war. If this breakdown of near-miss naval confrontations interests you, hit subscribe so you never miss the next critical incident that almost changed everything.